chapter 7, verse 1, after this I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind should blow on the earth or on the sea or upon any tree. And I saw another angel ascend from the sun rising, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a great voice to the 4 angels whom was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, we shall seal the servants of our God on their foreheads. And I heard the number of them that were sealed, 144,000, sealed out of every tribe of the children of Israel. We have in chapter 6 a series of 6 of 7 seal judgments that went on in chronological sequence. The 7th trumpet is blown as of chapter 8, and then chapters 8 or 9 introduces the 2nd series of judgments, which are the trumpet judgments. But in between, he discusses what's going to happen throughout the first half of the tribulation. He instructs the 4 angels in charge of the 4 winds not to allow the winds to hurt any part of the earth or the sea, or not even to hurt any trees until they seal 144,000 people. Later we'll find out in chapter 14 that these 144,000 are going to be single male, because the situation in the tribulation does not satisfy the situation of the tribulation and so on. So in verses 5, 6, 7, and 8, what he does is go on till there's 12 tribes, and we're told as a selection of 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes. And that makes up the total of 144,000. Now, some have mentioned there are 2 tribes missing, one of which they claim what the tribe of Ephraim is missing. Actually, it's not missing, but keep in mind that Jacob had 12 sons, one of whom was Joseph. And Joseph gave birth to 2 sons, and so the descendants of those 2 sons make up 2 half-tribes. Put together, they make up the tribe of Joseph. Sometimes Joseph is mentioned in representing Ephraim. Other times Joseph is mentioned to represent Manasseh. Manasseh is mentioned in verse 8, so he's not the issue. But what is not mentioned, but Joseph stands specifically for the tribe of Ephraim. He does mention Manasseh in verse 6. But in verse 8, he mentions the tribe of Joseph because Manasseh has already been mentioned. They will represent the tribe of Ephraim, so they're not missing. The one tribe that is missing is the tribe of Dan. And in some of the more speculative and more the sensational teachings in Bible prophecy, they keep emphasizing, providing different reasons why Dan is missing. Some believe Dan is missing because the Antichrist will arise out of the tribe of Dan, or because the false prophet will arise from the tribe of Dan, and so on. But these are guesses. It doesn't actually tell us why. And as in the first session we mentioned, Revelation does not quote any specific statement from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament. But it does have about 550 references back to the Old Testament. And sometimes we have to connect with those other references. There's 2 other locations that a listing of the 12 tribes has to drop out a name to maintain the symmetry of 12. So, for example, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 33, as it deals with the 12 tribal blessings that Moses gives, the tribe that is not mentioned is Simeon. And that's to maintain the symmetry of 12. Later on in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 47 and 48, the tribe of Levi is not mentioned when he talks about the actual settlement of the land. But that's also for the purpose of maintaining the symmetry of 12. So for the same reason that Moses left out his tribe and then Ezekiel left out the tribe that he was dealing with. So that is here's the reason why he leaves Dan out, just to maintain the symmetry of 12. Dan does not disappear because Dan is going to be the most northern tribe to be settled in the Israel of the Messianic kingdom. We'll come back to that a little bit later this evening. But that's the only reason why Dan is missing, to maintain the symmetry of 12. Because if you list all the tribal names, how many names would you have? 13, not 12. But because Joseph received the double portion of the firstborn birthright, he therefore sired 2 sons that would produce 2 half-tribes together, making the one tribe of Joseph. And God's going to use these 144,000. They come from the 4 winds, so they're not going to all come from Israel. They'll come from all the different parts of the world and proclaim the gospel throughout the world. As we learned early in our ministry, the preaching of the gospel is one thing, but the reception of it is quite another. So what success will they have? Look at chapter 7, verse 9. After these things, after what things? After the 144,000 Jews. After these things I saw, and behold, a great multitude which no man could number, out of every nation and of all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Let's skip down to verse 13. One of the elders answered, saying unto me, These that are arrayed in white robes, who are they, whence came they? And I said unto him, My Lord, you know. And he said unto me, These are they that come out of the great tribulation, and they washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Next thing John sees is myriads of Gentiles of all from different parts of the world, speaking different languages and so on, standing before the throne. And when John is asked about if he knows the identity, he says he doesn't know the identity. Now, John is one of the 12 apostles that laid down the foundation of the church. It would be unusual for him not to recognize that these are church saints. But the church is not mentioned after chapter 3. It's mentioned again only when you get to chapter 19. So these are not church saints that would have been removed before the tribulation starts, but these are saints that are going to be martyred during the tribulation. And upon martyrdom, while the body stays here, the immaterial part of their existence, so spirit, soul, body, heart, mind, conscience, immediately enters into God's presence. So as a result of the 144,000 Jews, the gospel will have such tremendous success among the Gentiles. And so this will accomplish one of the 2 main purposes of the tribulation, that of bringing about a worldwide revival. Now for the second purpose, let's go to Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12. The second key purpose is to break the will of the holy people, to break the will or power of the holy people. Beginning in chapter 11, especially 11 verse 36, the prophet is being given a vision of the conquerings and the conquests of the Antichrist as he begins to take over the entire world. And the prophecy that began in chapter 11 in verse 2 continues into chapter 12 and terminates in verse 4. Then in verses 5 and 6, a question will be raised as to how long will these terrible days of the tribulation, especially for Jewish people, continue. And when the answer is given, it also states that third purpose. So look at chapter 12, verse 7. And I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river, when he held up his right hand and left hand unto heaven, and swore by him to live forever, they shall be for a time, times and a half. And then notice, and when they're made an end of breaking in pieces the will or the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. In the first half of the tribulation, there is no peace. There is judgments and wars and so on. But the Jews suffer no more or no less than the Gentiles would suffer. But things change at the midpoint of the tribulation. And at that point, the Jews are targeted for destruction. For a reason we'll see a bit later tonight. And as a result of this massive persecution and attempt to destroy the Jews, then it'll eventually cause Israel to give up and finally turn to the Lord. And they will finally recognize that who the Messiah is indeed. The second passage we looked at under Israel present is in Isaiah chapter 28, verses 14 to 22. Isaiah 28, verses 14 to 22. And in this passage, it points out that the Jewish leaders of Israel will sign a covenant with the Antichrist. And it's not a peace treaty, as often mentioned, because the word peace is not found anywhere in those passages. But rather, the Antichrist guarantees Israel's military security. Israel leadership will trust not so much their God, but will trust the Antichrist to guarantee their military security. And as a result, they put their trust in it. And the same problems that was mentioned in Daniel chapter 9:27 is also mentioned here in Isaiah chapter 28, verses 14 to 22. And so the signing of the covenant will trigger the tribulation, but the halfway point, the tribulation covenant will be broken. At that point, the Jews are targeted for reasons we'll discuss more before this night is over. So the second major purpose is to break the will, to break the power of the holy people. They finally realize what they need to do, confess the sin or reject him on the grounds of being demonized. And then secondly, to call upon him to return, to mourn for him as one mourns for only son. Now, another thing to discuss briefly is parenthetical 2, which is the general description found in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 1 until chapter 4, verse 1. It has two parts. The first part is chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, how the tribulation will affect the Jewish leaders during this time of fleeing and being persecuted severely. But then in chapter 3, verse 16 through chapter 4, verse 1, the effect it would have on the Jewish women. Two things here. First of all, in verses 16 to 24, there'll be the removal of all luxury items. But then secondly, in chapter 3, verse 25 to chapter 4, verse 1, there's going to be a sharp reduction in the Jewish male population. So that by the time the tribulation is run its course, there'll be 7 Jewish women wanting to marry 1 Jewish man. That's how much the male Jewish population will be cut off. Many years ago, when I taught this in a different context, there was one Messianic Jewish believer who suggested he would prefer to go to the post-trib because he kind of likes the idea of having 7 Jewish women chasing him to be satisfied and so on. But I told him, you may not survive until the end. Then he went back to the pre-trib position. But that's what Isaiah describes. He describes what happens in the Day of Jehovah, and this is one of the severe populations. Now, parenthetical 3, there are Day of Jehovah passages which are dealing with Gentiles, but because we're dealing with Israelology, we'll focus on the passages that affect the Jewish population. And the most popular term for the tribulation in both testaments is Day of Jehovah, Day of the Lord, Day of Yahweh, and so on. And there are specific passages that focus on the Jewish people. For example, Ezekiel chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, Ezekiel 13, 1 through 7, the effect it will have on the false prophets that require a cleansing of the land, described in Zechariah 13, verses 2 through 6, Zechariah 13, verses 2 through 6. Then in Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, Joel 2, 1 through 11, is described as a time of darkness and invasion. In Joel 3, verses 14 through 17, Joel 3, 14 through 17, a time of refuge for the Jewish people. Amos chapter 5, verses 18 to 20. Amos 5, 18 to 20, a time of darkness. Zephaniah chapter 1, verses 7 through 13. Zephaniah 1, 7 through 13 will be especially heavy on the people of Jerusalem. Now, parenthetical 4 is also described as a time of worldwide anti-Semitism and a worldwide persecution of the Jews. Let's go ahead and look at Matthew chapter 24. The verses that we're looking at was going to be verses 15 through 28. In verse 15, Jesus gives the warning sign that when you see the abomination of desolation, he's building on what was spoken twice in the book of Daniel, in Daniel 9, verse 27, and then in Daniel 12, verses 11 through 13. In that, the abomination of desolation is when the Antichrist will break his 7-year treaty with Israel. He will take over the Jewish temple, proclaim himself to be God Almighty, and call upon the whole world to worship him as God and to signify their acceptance of his deity by taking the mark of 666. So when this event takes place, that's when the Jews are told you have to flee the land and you have to flee it quickly. And he points out there'll be certain elements that'll be a difficulty for them to quickly leave as they need to leave. So verse 16, let them that in Judea flee unto the mountains. Now Jerusalem itself is already in the mountains, so these are not the mountains of Judah, but other mountains, and ultimately it'll be the mountains on the east side of the Jordan. And in verse 17, if you're on the housetop, don't come off the house to go inside the house to take any possessions. As soon as your foot touches the ground, make your way out of the country. And in verse 18, if you're plowing in the field and you hear this event, don't go back to the kibbutz living quarters to take so much as a coat, but from where you've been plowing, make your way out of the country. And there are 3 major difficulties to make a quick escape, one of which is in verse 19. Women that give in advanced pregnancy states or only giving birth to newborn babes, it's difficult to escape as quickly with those situations. In verse 20, notice 2 other problems. Pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on a Sabbath day. Now keep in mind, Israel's pattern is a very fixed pattern as far as rain. And the rain season begins to fall at the end of October. Rains will fall the months of November, December, January, February. Will begin to peter out in March and end out by mid-April. So normally, with rare exception, no rain comes between mid-April and mid-October. And when Jews have to flee, he points out the event I'm describing is going to come for sure, but the things to pray for is pray that it won't happen during the winter months. Much of the escape routes will go through wadis, and wadis are dry all of summer, most of winter. But whenever the rain falls, you have these flooding situations that destroy highways. I lived in Israel for a total of 3 years, and wadis would often destroy the highways that I'd be driving on. And that again will limit to how quickly many Jews will be able to escape. So pray that your flight be not in winter. Furthermore, not on the Sabbath day. And the Sabbath begins sundown Friday and ends on sundown Saturday. And during those hours, no buses are running, no trains are running. Unless you have your own automobile, you'll again make escape, but that much more difficult. Because while Jews in the past have suffered local anti-Semitism, national anti-Semitism, regional anti-Semitism, for the first time in Jewish history, they'll suffer a worldwide anti-Semitism. And therefore, they're being faced and targeted. Let's go to another passage in Revelation chapter 12. This will be parenthetical 4. Matthew 4 is just one part of it, but look at Revelation 12, which is the same thing. As I mentioned, the Revelation never quotes any passage, but makes references back. And often in any section, he'll sometimes go back to a place in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, and then bring it up to the time of his future prophecy. Chapter 12 is one of those examples. In chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, he sees a vision of a woman arrayed with the sun and the moon and 12 stars. This harks back to Joseph's dream back in Genesis chapter 37. And from that passage, we learn that the sun represents Jacob, the moon represents Rachel, the 12 stars are the 12 sons of Jacob who fathered the 12 tribes of Israel. And Israel itself is portrayed as a woman because frequently in the Hebrew Bible, Israel is portrayed as the as the wife of Jehovah, the wife of Yahweh. And so that's what he's building on in this passage. So in this, he sees the Messiah about to be born. Therefore, the timing of this vision is the timing when soon Messiah would be born. At that point, we read in verse 3, there was another sign in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his heads 7 diadems. And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and he did cast them to the earth, and the dragon stands before the woman. He picks up, again, the woman motif representing Israel as the wife of Jehovah. Normally, as you just sit down and read the whole Hebrew Bible, that covers about 4,000 years of human history. You read about demons here and demons there. They're not very dominant, not very prominent. And when you suddenly come to Gospels, in the Gospels, there you see massive demonic activity. Everywhere the Messiah goes, he's confronted by demons. In one case, a whole legion of demons. And when you get past the Gospel and you go to the book of Acts, the book of Acts is the longest book of the New Testament. It's covers about 30 years of church history. Demons are mentioned only 4 times. Suddenly it drops down to what it was before the Gospel period. And this passage explains why. Normally, Satan has his demons spread throughout the world doing his bidding. However, just before the birth of the Messiah, he brought in all of his demons to be in and around the land of Israel to try to thwart the purpose of the first coming. And the first attempt was the slaughter of the babes of Bethlehem. And so all male children from the age of 2 and under were killed. But even after that event, throughout the Gospels, you see different attempts to have him killed, either at the wrong time, either before or after the specific Passover when he will die, or other ways to try to kill besides crucifixion, such as by sword or by stoning. And all such attempts fail with the statement, his hour was not yet come. It finally did come. He died at the proper time in the proper way, and therefore the atonement was made when it was destined to make. And so he failed to stop the program of atonement at that point. And if you look at verse 6, and the woman, go back to verse 5, and she was delivered of a child, of a son, a man-child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron, and a child was caught up unto God and unto his throne. So with the ascension of the Messiah, all attempts for him not to be able to complete the program of redemption and provision of salvation to all who believe. And therefore, Satan could no longer follow that pattern. He'll now try a different pattern. And that brings, and notice in verse 6, we see the same picture we just saw in Matthew 24, the woman Israel fleeing. And the woman fled into the wilderness, which was a place prepared of God, that they must nourish her 8,260 days. That's 3.5 years. She now escapes and goes to a place. In Matthew 24, it was to some mountain range, and now here into the wilderness area that she'll escape to. And where she escapes to, she will hide for protection. We'll come back to that in a few moments. Now in verse 7, we find ourselves again at the midpoint of the tribulation where specific event changes. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels going forth to the war with the dragon and his angels, and his dragon warred and his angels, and they prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast down, the old serpent, he does called the devil, the deceiver, the whole world, and was cast down to the earth. And his angels were cast down with him. So in the angelic sphere where he lives, Satan lives in the atmospheres we know from Ephesians chapter 2, verse 2, Ephesians 2:2, and Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, chapter 6, verse 12. While he lives there, he had access to heaven, as we see him using in the book of Job, chapters 1 and 2. He also had access to the earth because he usurped Adam's authority over the earth as a result of Adam's fall. And therefore, he is able to come to the earth, and he's called the God of this age and the Prince of this world, and so on. But now with this angelic conflict, the archangel Michael is going to succeed in overcoming the arch-cherub, who is Satan. He'll be cast down to the earth, and his demons will be cast down with him. So of the many, we don't have exact number, but we're told of all the angels that God created, 1/3 fell with Satan, 2/3 were made loyal to God. And so now they'll be confined to the earth for the second half of the tribulation. And there he'll be confined for 3.5 years. So verse 12 says, "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and ye that dwell in them." He now loses any free access to heaven for the purpose of accusing the brethren, and therefore is now for the second half of the tribulation limited this earth. Now, what will be his main activity on earth? Verse 12 continues, "Woe for the earth and for the sea, because the devil is gone down unto you, having great wrath, knowing but he had but a short time." Once he's confined to the earth, he recognizes the second coming is only 3.5 years away. So his goal is to try to annihilate all Jews in that 3.5 year period in order to avoid the second coming. And so in verse 13, "And when the dragon saw that he was cast down to the earth, he persecuted the woman that brought forth the man-child. And there was given to the woman the 2 wings of the great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness unto a place where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the face of the serpent." Now the Satan will focus his whole attention upon the woman, upon the people of Israel. And he even issues a flood against her. Whenever the figure of a flood is used symbolically, it's always a symbol of a military invasion. But the woman is able to escape to a specific place, as we shall see as we continue this evening. But he will be targeting her. Now, what does the wings of an eagle mean? A very popular prophecy teacher, who, if I mention his name, you'll recognize it, but the issue is not who it is, but what he says. And in his commentary on Revelation, he understands this woman represents Israel, but how does he interpret the 2 eagles, and the 2 wings of the eagle? He points out we all know that the eagle is a representative of the USA. So what Israel will need is the help of the American Air Force, to help the Jews to flee into the wilderness and so on. Now, the question is, why is he picking on the U.S.? Eagles also as a symbol of Poland. Now, maybe that's obvious. Also a symbol of Germany. Why not the Polish Air Force? Why not the German Air Force? Why the American Air Force? Because this prophecy rather is an American. He finally found a way to sneak America into Bible prophecy. So it's always wise to look at these references that's found in Revelation and where they originate back in the Hebrew Bible. One passage is Exodus chapter 19. Exodus chapter 19, where where the Bible says, I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. That's what God speaks to Moses. I brought you on eagle's wings and brought you unto myself. So somebody can prove to me that Moses had the help of the American Air Force. I'll accept that interpretation here, but not until then. But from that passage, we should notice the wings of an eagle reminds us of a successful escape after being pursued. A successful escape after being pursued. The Egyptian army pursued the Jews, but the Jews successfully escaped. And here the Antichrist army is pursuing them, and they escape. That's all the wings of an eagle means. There's a story in both American Jewish population and also the Jewish population in Israel and probably elsewhere. Only about 30% follow Orthodox Judaism. 70% are very secular. They do a few things that are Jewish here and there. They have the kids go through the bar mitzvah schooling, but otherwise not much work and working with Jewish synagogues and so on. And so it's become a secular society, and there's a story of a Jewish family moving into a new neighborhood, and the next door neighbors was a Baptist family. And both families had sons the same age, so the two sons became friends. So one day, the Baptist son asked the Jewish son to go with him to the Baptist Sunday school class. So the Jewish son asked the Jewish parents about getting permission to do so. The parents were very secular, but they're a bit nervous about this, so they told him, listen, you can just go to this Sunday school class just one time, but when you come back, you have to let us know what they all taught you. And just in case you need to give you a different perspective. The two sons went to the Sunday school, and when they came home, the Jewish parents took their son aside and asked them, what did they teach you in that Baptist school? And the son says, well, they taught us all about Moses. The parents are a bit surprised. Really? They taught you about Moses? Yes, they did. Well, what did they say about Moses? Well, the son says, what they said was when Moses was leading the Jews out of Egypt, they came to the Red Sea, and the Egyptian army began to chase them. And so what Moses did was build a pontoon bridge over the Red Sea. And the Jews crossed on this pontoon bridge, and when they succeeded in crossing to the other side, the Egyptian army began chasing them on the same pontoon bridge. But then Moses called for an airstrike that destroyed the bridge and therefore saved the Jews. And the parents are a bit surprised. Is that what they taught you at that Baptist school? And the son says, well, that's not the way they put it. If I told you what they really said, you'd never believe it. And that explains a bit of the nature of the Jewish community. But as you keep on reading, notice how he attacks the Jews now after initial failing. And verse 17, and the dragon waxed wroth with this woman and went away to make war with the rest of her seed, to keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Now notice here, he begins a war against the woman in general to try to destroy the whole Jewish community. But he especially focuses on one entity within the Jewish community, the Jews who are Messianic Jews at that time. And because of their Messianic standing, they know what the rest of the population has to do to bring about the return of the Messiah. And so he wars against the woman in general, but focuses more and more upon the Jewish remnant of that day. So let's now go to Israel and Satan, which is in this chapter. I'll go one step behind that, below that, Zechariah chapter 13. This would be parenthetical 6, Israel and Michael. Turn back to Daniel chapter 12. And look at verse 1, Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince who stands for the children of your people, Daniel's people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time the people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Now, Michael has actually two positions. He's called the archangel because he's in charge of all the angels. But there's another group of angels known as chief princes. And every nation where there's a Jewish population, maybe even more so, the chief prince from the side of God tries to influence the nation into a pro-Semitic element. But there's also Satan's chief princes that are fallen, and they work in those same nations to bring about and promote anti-Semitism. And so as a result, these two angels are conflicting. Eventually, how each nation goes depends what happens in that conflict. And so Michael will be the one to make sure the people of Israel will survive as a people. Will survive as a people. Okay. Parenthetically, the four groups of Jews. There'll be four different groups. The first group are the apostate Jews. These are the many who signed the covenant of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Trusting the Antichrist to guarantee their security. A second group will be the 144,000 Jews who are explained further in the first 5 verses of chapter 14 of Revelation, in that these 144,000 Jews are going to be the ones who bring about a worldwide evangelism. A third group are simply other Jewish believers. These are Jews individually who come in faith during the whole 7-year period, but not part of the 144,000 per se. And also the faithful remnant. The faithful remnant will be about a third of the Jewish people. They are the non-many who do not go along with the signing of the covenant. And they slowly go through the tribulation, unbelievers as far as Messiah is concerned, but also unbelievers as far as the Antichrist is concerned, until they reach towards the end when they realize what must happen and they become the believers at the end of the tribulation. And that is the faithful remnant. So in Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 and 9, Zechariah 13, verse 8 and 9, while 2/3 of the Jewish population around the world will die in the tribulation persecution, 1/3 survives. And this 1/3 become the center of what's going to happen in the need for the second coming and so on. So before we take the break, let's go ahead and try one more element, the parenthetical 9, the city of refuge. Well, we saw in 2 passages already where they flee to. In Matthew 24, they flee to the mountains, but the mountains are away from where Jerusalem is, so they'll run to the mountains on the east side of the Jordan. And then secondly, they'll flee to the wilderness, to area that is a desert area, desert territory. A passage you can write down is Isaiah 33, verses 13 through 16. Isaiah 33, 13 through 16. He mentions it'll be in a mountainous region, but it's also a mountainous, he calls munitions of rock. And the very nature of the place being so rocky, it'll make it very easy to defend. Now, exactly where this is, let's go to the prophet Micah. The prophet Micah. Just have to make a slight explanation because of the way Bibles have been translated. Micah has 3 prophecies, and each unit starts the same way. Hear ye, hear ye. So in chapter 1, verse 2, hear ye, ye peoples, and that covers chapters 1 and 2. And then look at chapter 3, verse 1, and I said, hear, I pray you, hear ye. That covers chapters 3, 4, and 5. And the third segment is in chapters 6 and 7, hear ye, chapter 6, verse 1. So keep in mind, chapters 1 and 2 is one unit. And while Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah, Isaiah was a city prophet with superb Hebrew. Micah is more of a country prophet, the rougher type of Hebrew. But and where he was living and where he was born was in an area known as the Shvelah, which is between the coastal plain flat, and you have the mountains of Judah, 3,000, 4,000 feet above sea level, but in between is the Shvelah, which is simply rolling hill country. So what he does, he lists all of these names in verses 8 through 16. Each of these are Hebrew names of real towns in the Shvelah region. But every Hebrew name has a specific meaning, and he makes wordplays with these names. For example, in the second part in verse 10, tell it not in Gad, weep not at all, at Beit Le'afra. Beit Le'afra means the house of dust. And notice the wordplay, in the house of dust have I rolled myself into dust. And for each of these towns you see going all the way to the end of verse 16, these are wordplays. The name has a specific name, but with that name, it gives a wordplay. And like Tsa'anan in verse 11, Tsa'anan means to go forth, but go forth town will fail to go forth, and so on. And keep in mind, when these books of Bible written, there were no chapter divisions, no verse divisions. So keep in mind, verse 12 is part of the first prophecy. Now, if you have certain translations like King James, or this one that I use, the ASV, American Standard Version, corrects it with that wordplay. So verse 12 says, I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of you. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together as the sheep in Bozrah, as a flock in the midst of their pasture. They shall make a great noise by reason of the multitude of men. The city of Bozrah is on the part of the east side of the Jordan, and it was part of the southern country of Jordan, what's in the Bible called Edom. Edom was a country. And in that country was the city of Bozrah, which means a sheepfold. And notice he plays a word game with the name and a flock in the midst of the pasture and so on. Now, if you have like the NASB or some other translation, then they translate the meaning of the name. But they should have left the name there because it's a wordplay like it was in chapter 1. So if you don't have that rendering, you can check with King James, you can check with the ASB and so on, but Bozrah is the specific city where the Jews will flee to. That will be what the bulk of the one-third percentage will get to. There'll be people, Jewish people, fleeing back to Egypt, we know, also into Syria, which is now Jordan and northern Iraq. But the bulk of the leadership and so on will be at this specific city. And this becomes crucial, understanding where the second coming will be initially come, and ultimately the final second coming, the conquest of Armageddon, all the way into the establishment of the kingdom. Well, it's time for your break, so we'll break here, and we'll pick it up from here in 15 minutes. But before we leave the part we're on about Bosra and so on, turn to Daniel chapter 11. Why would they choose to flee in that specific place? There's a principle you find if you read any Jewish history book, that one part of the world turns against the Jews, then God opens up another part of the world for the Jews to flee. And so the crucial date of 1492, when Columbus sailed the blue, the Jews began to flee into the New World. Now, in chapter 11 of Daniel, beginning in verse 36, he deals with the conquerings and the conquests of the Antichrist. And he's still dealing with that subject as we come to verse 41. Daniel 11, verse 41. You shall also enter into the glorious land, which will be Israel, and many nations shall be overthrown, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. As the Jews are fleeing the land of Israel and so on, the bulk of the remnant will flee to this area, which is not under the Antichrist control. And these three ancient nations stay free. And all three of those nations make up only one country today, and that is the country of Jordan, the nation of Jordan. And because that's the only place they can flee to, that becomes the city of refuge. Now, on your outline, if you look at small d, the remnant of Israel, I'm not going to detail this because this is our last 45-minute session, but for the place where it says the fact of the remnant, that will be Isaiah chapter 10, verses 20 to 23. Isaiah 10, verses 20 to 23, the promises, no matter how severe the persecutions come, there will be a remnant that will escape. And 4 times they are referred to as the escaped of Israel. 4 times. Isaiah chapter 4, verse 2, Isaiah 4, verse 2, chapter 37, verses 31 and 32, Isaiah 37, verses 31 and 32. Joel chapter 2, verse 32, Joel 2:32, and the book of Obadiah. I forget what chapter it's in, but the verse is 17. Some of you are a bit slow on that one. As far as parenthetical being the protection of the remnant, that's in Isaiah 41, verses 8 through 16, 41 verses 8 through 16, and as for the provision for the remnant, where God will supernaturally provide them with food and water, that's in Isaiah 41, verses 17 through 20, Isaiah 41, verses 17 through 20, and also Isaiah chapter 65, verses 8 through 16. Isaiah 65, verses 8 through 16. Okay, let's go to page 15 and look at point 3, as Israel and the second coming. And the first thing we have to deal with is what is the basis of the second coming of the Messiah. And let's turn to Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus chapter 26. Now, let's keep in mind there are 2 very different distinctives between the rapture and the second coming. The rapture is part of God's program for the church. And once Jerusalem was destroyed in the year AD 70, that rendered the imminency of the rapture could happen any moment of time between right now and the signing of the 7-year covenant. It's not the rapture that will trigger the tribulation, that's the signing of the covenant. The rapture will occur sometime before the signing of that covenant. That's God's program for the church. That's not the focus of this series, but the focus of this series is on the second coming on behalf of Israel. In the book of Leviticus chapter 26, Moses outlines the eventual falling of Israel. Begins with the blessings of Israel when they are obedient, but when they begin slipping into disobedience and idolatry and so on, they fall into periods of disobedience and different types of divine discipline. First will come subjugation, which was fulfilled in the days of the judges. Secondly will be captivity, which is the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. But thirdly, a worldwide dispersion resulting of Israel's failure to recognize the Messiah, who is a prophet like unto Moses. By the end of verse 39, the worldwide dispersion is a fact. And to this day, while the number of Jews in Israel do outnumber the American Jewish community now, if you count all the Jews, there's still more Jews outside the land than inside the land. So at the end of verse 39, all these prophecies have been quite literally fulfilled. Now in verse 40, and they shall confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in the trespass which they trespassed against me. And also that because they walked contrary unto me, I also walked contrary unto them and brought them into the land of their enemies. If then their uncircumcised heart be humbled, and they then accept of the punishment of their iniquity, then will I remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham will I remember, and I will remember the land. As he points, notice the word iniquity is singular. He points out there is one specific sin that people need to confess before they can enjoy all of the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant, which will come with the second coming of the Messiah. And so this is one key issue, the precondition to the second coming, the national salvation of Israel, which involves their confession of dealing with that specific sin that caused them to reject the Messiah. Let's go to the second passage, which is Jeremiah chapter 3. In Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 11 through verse 18, deals with their need to recognize their failure. And again, as he talks about a specific iniquity or specific transgression, it's singular. As in verse 13, only confess your iniquity, singular, that what you have done and so on. And once this is done, then they'll begin to enjoy the second coming and messianic kingdom. So in verse 14, notice, they'll be regathered one by one till every Jew is back in the land. In verse 15, God will in that day give them righteous shepherds that will feed them with knowledge and understanding and never be guilty of leading the nation astray. And in verse 16, they won't so much as think of rebuilding the Ark of the Covenant, because in verse 17, God himself will rule from Jerusalem and from the throne of David in the person of the Messiah. And in verse 18, when the Jewish people undergo the final restoration, they won't come back as two nations, Israel north and Judah south. There'll be one nation coming together and being ruled by the Messiah himself. Now for another example, let's go to Zechariah chapter 12. In Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, he describes all the armies of all the nations coming against the Jews. The goal is to annihilate the Jews before they undergo a national salvation. and if Satan can succeed in destroying the Jews, there will never be a second coming. So, within discussing the problem of this invasion, look at verse 7 of chapter 12. Jehovah also shall save the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem be not magnified above Judah. And so notice in verse 7 there's going to be a sequence, but the sequence begins to save the tents, not their homes, but the tents of Judah first, showing Judah's living in tents away from the land. Well, he'll come to them to save them first, before he comes to Jerusalem to save the Jews still left in Jerusalem. As a result, notice in verse 10, I will pour upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. They shall look unto me whom they have pierced, and they shall mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and shall be in bitterness for him as one does in bitterness for his firstborn. Notice in the context of Armageddon, while the armies now come against the Jews, not so much in Armageddon, that's when the armies got together, and they come against the Jews of Jerusalem and so on. The Jews of Jerusalem begin to look unto the one whom they once pierced, to mourn for him as one mourns for an only son. And that will lead in verse 11 down to chapter 13, verse 1. All of the Jews that are still living will come together in different segments to confess their rejection of the Messiah. And the result in chapter 13, verse 1, in that day there shall be a fountain opened to the house of David and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem for sin and for uncleanness. So these are prerequisites for the second coming to occur. Let's look at Hosea, the first minor prophet, Hosea chapter 5. Throughout the 5th chapter of Hosea, it is God who is doing the speaking, and God is still speaking. As we come to verse 15 of Hosea 5, I will go and return to my place until they confess their offense and seek my face. In their affliction, they will seek me earnestly. So God is speaking, he's returning to his place. Before God can return to his place, he must first leave it. And when did God leave heaven? At the incarnation, when God became man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. But then because of a specific offense, again, the word offense is singular. Because of one specific offense, he went back to heaven when he ascended from the Mount of Olives. He goes on to add, he will not come back to the earth until they confess their offense and seek his face. With the last phrase, in that in their affliction they will seek me earnestly. Here's a place where chapter got split where it should not have been split. When these things were written, they had no chapters or verse divisions. But the first 3 verses of chapter 6 belong with chapter 5. And chapter 6 would fit better beginning with verse 4. But in verse 15, he spelled out the prerequisite to the return of the Messiah. And in verses 1, 2, and 3, notice this is Israel's future response. It's an edict or calls which are issued by Israel's leaders. Come, let us return unto Jehovah. He hath torn, he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days will he revive us. On the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live before him. And let us follow on to know the Lord. His going forth assures the morning, and he will come unto us as the rain, the latter rain that waters the earth. In response to the demand of 5:15, the Jewish leaders will finally recognize why all these things have happened to them. And that will bring about a call to national repentance for the first 2 of those last 3 days before the second coming. They will confess the national sin of rejecting him on the grounds of being filled with Beelzebub. And the third day, the whole nation will come to faith. As when the whole nation will come to faith, they will then plead for the Messiah to return. Now, let's look at one more passage before we focus on where the initial place of the second coming will occur. Let's go to Matthew chapter 23. Under Israel present, we dealt with the 7 woes of Matthew 23 as he closes his public ministry. 7 woes are pronounced upon that generation that rejected him. When it comes to a close, he closed with a lament. Verse 37, O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, that kills the prophets and stones them that are sent unto her, how often would I have gathered your children together, even as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, but ye would not. Literally in Greek, you willed it not. So now in verse 38, behold, your house is left unto you desolate. The house is the temple, be destroyed 40 years after these words are spoken. But now notice verse 39. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth till ye shall say, Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. This was a common saying in first century Judaism, that when the Messiah comes, you must welcome him in Hebrew, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. But in reality, they'll have to say this first. Not before he comes. Say this before he comes, not after he comes. But after he comes, it's already too late. And so this will be that will finally trigger the second coming. Okay. Let's go now deal specifically with the second coming. And let's go to Isaiah chapter 34. Isaiah chapter 34. In the first 4 verses, he describes, I won't take time to read it because we're running out of time. The first 4 verses are dealing with all of the armies of all of nations coming together, attacking a specific population. And as we already noted, it'll be the population of Israel, especially in the area of Bozrah. But for now, in the first 4 verses, he simply emphasizes all these nations coming together. Now look at verse 5. For my sword had drunk its fill in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Edom. And that's the southern part of Jordan. And upon the people of my curse the judgment. So the nation where all these armies come together to attack the Jewish people will be the land of Edom, which is now southern Jordan. But the next verse gets more specific. Look at verse 6. The sword of Jehovah is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, with the blood of lambs and of goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For Jehovah had a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Edom. So a specific city within Edom where all these nations are coming together to try to wipe out the Jews is the city of Edom in the land of Moab. In the city of Bozrah and the land of Edom. Now more descriptive is the second passage we should turn to, Isaiah chapter 63. In chapter 63, Isaiah is standing in his vision along the mountain ranges of Israel, looking towards the southeast, and suddenly he sees a figure, a glorified figure, approaching him. And so a question and answer session ensues between Isaiah the prophet and this individual. 2 questions are raised and 2 answers are given. The first question is in verse 1. Who is this that comes from Edom? That's the country today in the southern part of Jordan, with dyed garments from Bozrah. There's a specific city. This that is glorious in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength. And the answer is, I that speak in righteousness, mighty to save. Only one person who can fit this description, who walks in the very glory of his power, full ability to save, whose very clothing is shining with the brightness of the Shekinah glory. But then as the figure gets closer in this vision, he sees that the glorified clothing has been stained with blood, and that raises the second question in verse 2. Wherefore are you red in your apparel, and your garments like him that tread the wine vat? As he answers that question in verses 3 through 6 is this. He alone will come back for the purpose of trampling the enemies of Israel. In the course of the trampling, their lifeblood has spilled over and stained his garments. At the second coming, the angelic army will come back with him. Also, the church saints come back with him, but neither the angels nor we will participate in the fighting. We'll simply have an observance of how he alone will destroy the entire invading army. And that's the initial place of the second coming. Only then he'll move towards back to Jerusalem. And that will bring him into the valley of Jehoshaphat, a valley that separates the old city, the temple compound, from the Mount of Olives. And that's going to be the initial place of the second coming. Let's move on to the Messianic kingdom, point 4 on page 15. What is emphasized in replacement theology at schools, there's 3 different classes of replacement theology. And what they claim is that the figure 1,000 years is mentioned in only 1 chapter, which is found in a highly symbolic book, and that is chapter 20 of Revelation. And therefore, it should not be understood that someday there's going to be a literal kingdom. But the amillennialists who do not believe in the future kingdom say that the kingdom is already here between the first and second coming. Those who are postmillennial would say the church will someday conquer the world with the gospel and then will establish the kingdom. But you don't find that sequence at all in any scripture, either the amill view or the postmill view. And we must also point out it's true that the 1,000 years is only mentioned in Revelation 20, but by the way, it mentions it 6 different times. And repetition tries to do anything, it tries to make a specific point. But the truths about the kingdom, there's a lot more material in the Hebrew Bible than there is the New Testament. A lot more. Now, there's 2 things that the Hebrew Bible does not answer. Number 1, how long will the kingdom last? That's why Jews say Messianic kingdom. They don't say millennium because that gives us a time element. How long will the kingdom last? Finally, Revelation 20 answers that it will last 1,000 years. And the second question it raises is what will be the circumstances that bring the kingdom to an end? And that'll be the release of Satan, who will do his one last work of deception, and so on. But Revelation 20 is not the basis for believing in the Messianic kingdom. It just provides us how long it's going to last and how it is going to end. But the actual basis for belief in the Messianic kingdom is based on two things. Number one, the unfulfilled covenantal promises of those 4 unfulfilled promises we began with 4 days ago. And in these unconditional covenants, each of those 4 covenants make provisions and promises. In each case, some are fulfilled immediately, some are fulfilled in the near future, some have not been fulfilled as yet, and so waiting the Messianic kingdom to be fulfilled. And so it is necessary to understand that this is necessary to fulfill the unfulfilled promises of God's unconditional covenants with the people of Israel. The second thing that's based upon it happens to be the unfulfilled prophecies of the Jewish prophets. And the prophets elaborated on what the covenants had said in tremendous detail. So much detail you have to ignore a lot of scripture to not take it as it is written. So for example, the regeneration of Israel is based upon the new covenant that promises a future salvation of Israel. Individual Jews coming to faith has been fulfilled, but the national salvation has not yet happened. That will require the context of the second coming. Secondly, there is the regathering of Israel. And based upon the land covenant of the book of Deuteronomy, chapters 29 and 30, and everybody agrees that chapter 29 has been literally fulfilled. All replacement theologians believe that because they have no choice. There is a worldwide dispersion of the Jewish people. But then they want to ignore chapter 30 and try to allegorize it away. But the same people that God dispersed will be the same people he'll regather them, and that's the Jewish people. The third element is the possession of the land, which is based upon the Abrahamic covenant, with specific borders already given. But the Jewish people never had all of the promised land through biblical history, nor do they have it now. Furthermore, both in the dispersion, they suffer persecution, and even now, they suffer attacks. And the worst attack since the Holocaust is what happened on October 7th. But only once they undergo their national salvation, that's when they will finally possess all of the promised land, they'll settle in all of the promised land, and finally live in peace in all of the promised land. I go to page 16. The fourth covenant is the establishment of the Davidic throne, the reestablishment. That's based upon the Davidic covenant. And as with all the other covenants, certain things have been fulfilled, certain things have not yet been fulfilled. And while the Messiah has come as the son of David, He's not sitting on the throne of David today. He's sitting on the throne of God the Father. That's not the promise of the covenant, that someday he will sit on the throne of David, ruling over Israel, and ruling from Jerusalem on earth, not Jerusalem up in heaven. Okay, just enough time to deal with two other items. Let's go down to small d, the millennial mountain of Jehovah's house. This book is in the back, and you can look through it after we make the comments over here. This is on page 237. map 96. What you see here is the War of Armageddon. There'll be 8 stages to this war. We'll leave it here in a moment. And so all of these 8 stages are seen in this map. And it shows how it'll come to Petra or Bosra first, go north in the valley of Jehoshaphat. After saving the tents of Judah, he'll save the Jews still in Jerusalem. And when the fighting is over, in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 3, in verse 4, his feet will stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. It doesn't say about descending on it. He could descend on it. He could climb up on it. But that will mark the end of the campaign of Armageddon. It begins a 75-day period between the end of tribulation and the inauguration of the Messianic kingdom. A number of things will take place in that 75-day period. But when the land is, all the Jews are brought back. Here's another map in this book. What's going to happen, if you look at the side here, they won't be in the same territory as it was in the book of Joshua. Some parts the same, some parts not the same. But Lebanon has always been part of the promised land. That part of the promised land the Jews never had. So Dan was the most northern tribe, but they were just south of Lebanon and so on. So it's going to happen, there'll be 7 tribes moving from north to south across the whole boundaries. Then there'll be a mountain, I'll come back to it. Then south of the mountain, the remaining 5 tribes here. The first time they'll be settled in all of the promised land. What happens is, there's going to be a major earthquake described in Zechariah chapter 14 that will change the geography of the land to some degree. And right in the center of the mountain, which you see here, his enlargement of it, will be the mountain that will become the highest mountain in the world. On top, there'll be a 50-mile square plateau, an approximation mile. And it'll be divided into 3 subdivisions. In the northern section, which is going to be 50 miles by 20 miles, will be in the center where the millennial temple will stand. It will not be in Jerusalem. It'll be a number of miles north of Jerusalem. And that's where the temple will be. It'll be the largest temple. The temple building alone will be about 1 mile square. It won't fit on the present-day Temple Mount, which is only about 1/4 mile square. But there'll be a temple there. And the rest of the territory will be for 1 line of priests. These are Jewish priests from the line of Zadok. Zadok was their loyal priest to David and then to Solomon. And so they're rewarded in the Messianic kingdom to be the Jewish priests in the millennial temple. However, they will not be alone, because what the Mosaic law did not allow, the kingdom law will allow. In Isaiah 66, God also chose Gentiles also to serve as priests in this temple. So we're dealing with a new law system, kingdom law, not Mosaic law, or law of Messiah, and so on. In south of them will be a second section, also numbering 20 by 50 miles. And right smack in this whole section would be the tribe of Levi. So Levites who are not of the line to be priests will be living in this section here. Right on the boundary line between the north section, central section, would be 20 chambers. And Levites who are assigned to work in the temple compound, they will live in these chambers for a while, travel to the temple, follow and do the caretaking of the temple compound and so on. And then they will come, and after so many months or so, it will be changing their space. They'll go back to the mainlands, and so to speak, and new priests will live in these chambers and do their job and so on. When you get to the southern end, it measures 50 miles by 10 miles, right in the center here, will be the millennial Jerusalem. It won't be assigned to any tribe, but it points out there'll be Jews of all 12 tribes, members that will be living in the city. On both sides of the city will be ground for growing food for the residents of Jerusalem. So, and this will be 10 by 20 miles this side, 10 by 20 miles that side, a food growing area. As far as how they'll grow, there'll be a new river flowing from the temple, moving east. As slowly it moves south, go through the territory of Levi and come into Jerusalem. When it gets into Jerusalem, then the river will split in two directions. The river will flow towards the west through this land on the west, providing the water they would need, and they'll flow into the Mediterranean. The second eastern branch will flow this way and will flow to the east and will empty into the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is called the Dead Sea because it's so full of minerals, fish cannot survive. And if there's pictures of fish going into the Dead Sea, when they get to that, many of them make a U-turn to get back up the Jordan River because they cannot survive at that much of a thickness. And so the northern section of the Dead Sea and the central section of the Dead Sea will become a major fishing business. Then you might ask, well, suppose we want to float in the Dead Sea. Well, you can't float where people float today. You got to go to the southern end. They'll still be given over to salt, according to Ezekiel's prophecy. And so if you want to float and never drown, just go to the south end, and there's your nice trip. So this is the essence of the difference in geography and so on. Okay? Anyway, I'll leave it here, that you can look at it. Okay, one more thing to cover, and that is the eternal order. Let's turn to Revelation 21. Even in the eternal order, you'll see this distinctive between Jews and Gentiles. It doesn't detail any functional differences for the eternal order, because what we know about the eternal order is something very limited. And its further revelation will be given to us when we finally get to that place. Now keep your finger in Revelation 21, and by way of introduction, let's go to Hebrews 12. We're going to go back to chapter 21 momentarily. Here he describes the New Jerusalem as it exists at the moment, up in the third heaven, and he begins to list some groups of residents. Let's look at verse 22 of chapter 12. But ye are come unto Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. So he's describing not the earthly one, but the heavenly one. And notice one group, to the innumerable hosts of angels. And so the angels that did not fall with Satan, they're part of the holy angels, and they will be living in this already in the New Jerusalem. Verse 23, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. Here you have one group of saints, and he calls them by the church. He might be referring to the church as a whole, although say from Acts 2 until the rapture occurs. Because he talks about the firstborn, he may be, and this is an epistle written to Messianic Jews like James, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Jude. And therefore he might be referring to the Jewish believers of the first century. But as the reason can go either way. The next element, and God the judge of all, now that will represent God the Father, to the spirits of just men made perfect. These are the Old Testament saints. They were justified when they believed, as in Genesis 15:6. In the case of Abraham, Abraham believed God. It was reckoned to him for righteousness. And so these are spirits of just men made perfect. But they were perfected only when Messiah died. Once he died, the sins were taken away. So at that point, they were removed from the Abraham's bosom. And when the Messiah ascended, these ascended with him back into heaven. And also he mentions, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, God the Son is there, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better than that of Abel, and evidence when he brought the blood into heaven for the purpose of cleansing the heavenly sanctuary because of Satan's fall. This is not a complete list. For example, he does not mention the Holy Spirit, but he does mention the Spirit in the next passage, going back to Revelation 21. So he's not trying to make a complete list, only a sample list. Now look at verses 12 and 13. Revelation 21, verses 12 and 13. Verse 12, for having a wall great and high, having 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels, and the names written thereon, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. And so what we learn is that this heavenly Jerusalem, as it comes down upon the new earth, will have 12 gates. Each of the gates are named after the 12 sons of Jacob. So these Jewish names will go on indefinitely, forever and ever. Now if you skip over to Revelation 21 and verse 24. Let's look at that passage first. 21:24. And the Gentiles shall walk amidst the light thereof, and the kings of the earth bring their glory into it, and the gates thereof shall in no wise be shut by day, for the things and there shall be no night there, and they shall bring the glory of and honor of the nations into it. And so he also mentions Gentiles who will have also be in a glorified state, and also mentioning Gentiles shows the Jewish Gentile distinctive continues for all eternity. It doesn't provide all the details that we would like to have because there's a lot of focus on the kingdom, very little revealed on the eternal state. So a lot is waiting for us to learn once we arrive there. Now one more thing. In contrast to those in the New Jerusalem and enjoying the new earth, there are also those in the lake of fire. And look at chapter 22, verse 15, where he mentions different groups that never believed. But he starts out with the phrase, without are the dogs. Why is that significant? Because for 54 years, I was married to a woman who was a fanatical cat lover. And she went around gathering cats and so on. We've had as many as 7 cats at one time. And she was very protective of them. Once she adopted them and brought them into the house, they could never go out the house. Because you never know what wild animals might attack the kitten or cat and eat them. So they were safely within the walls of the home. And if any got sick, she would take them to a vet for a CAT scan. And furthermore, her cats never truly died. They simply entered their eternal catatonic state. And sometimes I would be on a speaking tour that sometimes she comes with me, sometimes she didn't. But I would come home, I will see all 7 cats occupying my side of the bed. I have to put up a fight with those cats just to have the right to sleep next to my own wife. And when people would ask her, well, why do you believe all cats go to heaven? That was her position. She takes it to this verse: the dogs are in the lake of fire. Doesn't mention cats going to lake of fire. And that was her theological position. But she was always sweet about it. Okay, our time is, we have the last 14 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand until our time is up. Who's got the first question? We've got written questions again. Where do you think that the tribulation temple will be built? In the city of David or in the Temple Mount? For the Jewish people, if they wanted to build a temple outside the Temple Mount, they could have done it back in 1948. For the Jewish people, there's no other place to build it except on the Temple Mount. In some situations, people say, well, the Temple Mount will need to be, the temple, the Dome of the Rock, I should say, should be destroyed. It could be destroyed, but not necessarily, because if you go on today, and Herod the Great had enlarged the Temple Mount, much bigger than it was in Solomon's day. And therefore, if you look at where the Dome of the Rock is, right in the center, moving southward, you have all kinds of Muslim buildings, the Muslim temple and so on, but from going north in that direction, it's all empty space. There's a possibility they'll divide the south from the north and have the Jews build on the Temple Mount on the north side. We don't know. And so the temple will be rebuilt. It'll have to be built on the Temple Mount. Exactly how that's going to come about, we'll have to wait till it happens. Please explain the judgment on the sheep and the goat nations. Are individuals judged for anti-Semitism and actions and attitudes? In that 75-day period, which is in Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46, also Joel chapter 3, verses 1, 2, 3, in both passages, it mentions that at the time of the second coming begins a 75-day interval. The length of that interval is in Daniel 12, verses 11 through 13. And in that interval period, all the Gentiles who survive will be brought left separate into 2 camps, the sheep Gentiles and the goat Gentiles. The sheep Gentiles are the believers of the tribulation who showed their faith by their pro-Semitic works. And therefore they will enter the Messianic kingdom in those different countries from where they come. And church saints and tribulation saints will be co-ruling with the Messiah over the Gentiles, because there'll be 2 branches of government. Now the goat Gentiles are the unbelievers of the tribulation who showed their anti-Semitism by joining the Antichrist goal of Jewish annihilation. And this judgment, they'll be killed and confined to hell. And so there'll be a Jewish branch of government, a Gentile branch of government, and church saints will rule over the Gentile branch. But the resurrected David, 4 times we're told he will co-rule with the Messiah in the kingdom of Israel. Below it, David will be the 12 apostles. They'll sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. And he made that prophecy 2 different times. Are you a cessationist, and why? I'm assuming this is dealing with the spiritual gifts. First of all, I'm a cessationist only because of chapters 2 and 3 of Ephesians, where he talks about 2 gifts, which were meant for the foundation of the world. That's the gift of apostleship and the gift of prophecy. But nothing indicates a cessation of any other gifts. We should interpret those other gifts biblically, like the speaking in tongues and so on. Does that gift said to be ceased? Doesn't say it. But we have examples like in Acts 2, when they spoke, didn't just repeat 3 or 4 syllables as fast as they can, which is often passed through. They actually were speaking in, hearing in different languages, the message of the Apostle Peter in that context. And so I'm not a cessationist on any of those other gifts except for prophecy and apostleship. Otherwise, God can still give those gifts. We need to define them biblically and not merely what we think we were taught correctly and so on. Who are the so-called Palestinians from? The Palestinians are the Arab population are from the larger Arab peoples. The term Palestine was given to the name of the country under Hadrian back in the 2nd century after the failure of the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome. And so at that point, he had a policy to de-Judaize the countries. He made Jerusalem and about a 20-mile radius or so off limits for all Jews. So Jews had to move elsewhere in the land, but they could no longer live in that section. And so he renamed the land Palestina. It was named after the Philistines. The Philistines were not Arab peoples, they were of a Greek origin. But the name stuck. But because there was always Jews on the land, the term Palestinian was applied to Jews, not to the Arabs. And when we were escaping from Poland after World War II, I mentioned in my testimony that we had the help of the Israeli underground, but there was no Israel yet. And they were actually the Palestinian underground. And the Palestinian underground were Jews. And the term Palestine was applied to the Jews of the land until the Six-Day War in 1967. Then there was a transition where the term Palestinian was now limited to the Arab population living in the borders of the land of Israel. And so that's the way it is to this day. So Jews no longer call themselves Palestinians. But until 1967, that was an appropriate title. When I went to Hebrew University, I majored in what they call Palestinology. But nobody thought that strange, because the term was used for the Jews. But with the Six-Day War, things changed radically. But the Palestinians are part of the larger Arab community. And so they're not distinctively distinct, except since 1967. How do you define a Jew after centuries of mixing with other cultures? What if one parent is not Jewish? Well, first of all, the Jews were always forced to living by themselves in ghettos outside the land and so on, so there wasn't that much intermarriage till the ghettos came down. The growth of intermarriage began about the 1800s, when ghettos began to fall. But a Jew is any descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob on the father's side. How many Gentile mothers there may be is irrelevant. In fact, David had 2 Gentile mothers in a row. He's not a half Jew, he's not a 3/4 Jew or 1/4 Jew. He's just a Jew because on the male line. If you look at all of the genealogies, a lot of them in the Old Testament too in the New Testament, women are either not mentioned at all, or if they are, they're mentioned in passing. They're not directly relevant to the genealogy. So it's a matter of if the father was Jewish, and David, father and grandfather were Jewish, he was classed as a Jew, although there were some Gentile mothers involved, and so on. Now, if a child is born of a Gentile mother and a Jewish father, then the Jewish father determines the ethnic identity of the child. But the reversal is not quite the same. And if you look in the case of Timothy, who had a Jewish mother and a Gentile father, a Greek father, because of that situation, the child has a choice. He can identify either with the Jewish identity and therefore identify as a Jew, or the Gentile identity, identify himself as a Gentile. But if he chooses to identify as a Jew, guess what happens to a male child, not child anymore, an adult? He has to undergo circumcision, which for adults are rather painful, but Timothy did that. So at that point, Timothy, Jewish mother, Jewish grandmother, what we know for sure, and so on. So if today you have a child born of both Jewish parents, the Jews, if the father is Jewish, the mother is Gentile, they're Jewish, biblically. Rabbinically, they changed the rule in the Middle Ages when you had the Crusades coming through, and many Jewish women who were married were raped by these Crusaders, and 9 months later came a baby. They weren't always sure who was the father. Was it the husband or was it the Crusader? So the law began to change. And because obvious who the mother is, from then on the mother determined the ethnic identity. But biblically, that was not the case. And so on. So if you go by the Bible, the father is Jewish, the child is Jewish. If you go by the mother's side only, then you follow rabbinic tradition and not actually reality. So that's the way. So people who are mixed birth and their father is Gentile can still identify with the Jewish people. Wow, 3 questions. Okay, let me go through these fast. Is there any warrant for teaching that Acts 2 will be reversed? The restrainer will cease to restrain. And the church he left with, the Holy Spirit indwelling but no longer outpoured. The Bible now indicates I need to check a precious name, where he has some weird doctrines with so on. But there's no, when the Bible is the reversal of Acts 2, when the Bible is the Jewish identity reversed, where is it? It doesn't. So just follow with the text. When the text stops, just stop. Don't speculate, don't exaggerate, and so on. After the rapture, will there be any Gentile Christians, or God's focus be completely on converting Israel? Well, one passage we'll look today in Revelation 7. The 144,000 Jews will do the evangelizing, but most of those people listed from verse 9 through verse 17 are all Gentiles. And so, after the rapture, many Gentiles will come to saving faith, as well as the Jews. Is there a possibility that the Magog invasion occurs at the end of the millennium? There is a Magog at the end of the millennium, but it's not the same as the Magog of chapters 38 and 39 of the book of Ezekiel, because in the book of Ezekiel, we only have some nations coming together under the authority of Gog, and these nations some are Muslim nations, some are not. But when they come together, that's all that comes together. But in the Gog and Magog issue, that became idiomatic for any invasion of Israel. And there it's now limited to certain nations. In Revelation 20, it is, at the end of chapter 20, it is from all over the world. So Gog and Magog is the initial effect, and what's happening in Revelation 20 is idiomatic, like he met his Waterloo. But Waterloo is an event that brought about the downfall of Napoleon. And when people rise in power or in offices or in business, and suddenly they collapse, there's a saying, he met his Waterloo, and so on. So these are just idiomatics, but some of these questions just seem to be out of somebody else's mind, and but it's not something that you can find in the text. So Acts 2 will not be reversed. At the rapture, Acts 2 is removed, but not reversed. Okay. Maybe 1 minute for one question. Okay, who's got the microphone? This will be just one question since our time is up.
Can you hear me? Oh. Sorry, I won't take long. I'm asking on behalf of my husband, who's been listening online from another country, and it was his dream to meet you.
Could you just talk a little bit louder? Hold it closer to your mouth.
Oh, yeah. I'm asking this question on behalf of my husband, who was in dreams to be here today, but he's listening online from another country. And the question is, was just to ask you if you could expound a little on the form of worship of God before the law was given, namely the Melchizedek in order?
Well, Melchizedek was a priest in the days of Abraham, but there was no order of worship per se, because the believing community is quite small. But once you have people multiplying under Moses and so on, so with the whole Mosaic system, there were to be corporate worship segments, which are limited to 3 festivities: the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And that's when they would come from all over the country to where the tabernacle was. So originally they met in Shiloh, but ultimately they met in Jerusalem. And that became the place of corporate worship. The Sabbath was not a day of corporate worship. It was simply a day of rest. You stay within the Sabbath day's journey of your home. That's about 2,000 cubits. It's about a modern day kilometer. And that's the area they would have to stay home. They may have worship as a family and things of that nature. But as far as corporate worship, there wasn't any weekly corporate worship, but there was annually 3 periods of corporate worship. Passover would be 1 day plus 7. And Feast of Weeks was 1 day, and the Feast of Tabernacles was 8 days. So those were the periods of corporate worship. Okay, our time is up, sadly. The Lord willing, we'll see you either here or there or in the air.
Thank you so much, Arnold. It was truly an honor and pleasure to have you with us in New Zealand again. And we pray that you travel safely back to the United States. And Lord willing, we will see you again in New Zealand. So watch this space. We will do our best to get him back in the near future. Thank you very much, everybody, and drive safe. Bye-bye.